All right. Cheers, everyone. We're cracking open a new topic today, diving deep into the world of wine tariffs.
Ooh, tariffs.
Yeah. Using 3 recent Wine Maps articles as our guide, all published, like, this week.
This week, okay.
You might be thinking, wine tariffs? Sounds a bit dry.
Yeah, maybe a little.
But trust me, this stuff gets juicy.
Okay, I like where this is going.
We're talking culture clashes, global power moves, even what ends up in your glass.
It really is fascinating, how wine, something usually about celebration, enjoyment, gets all tangled up in economics and politics.
Totally. So before we get into the, nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
Can you give us a, clear definition of what wine tariffs are, for those of us who haven't been studying international trade agreements all week?
Of course. Simplest terms, it's a tax on imported wines.
Okay, so
when that bottle from, say, Argentina or Italy gets here,
right,
the government adds an extra charge, basically makes those imports more expensive compared to, what's produced locally.
Interesting. So I can already see how that might cause some, tension between countries.
Oh, absolutely.
The Wine Maps articles mention tariffs can be a big boost for local winemakers, though, right? Is that always true?
It's a common argument for them, yeah. The idea is imported wines get pricier.
Yeah.
Domestic producers, they get a leg up, right? Mm-hmm. More competitive in their own market leads to increased sales. They can invest more in their businesses, potentially even better quality wines.
Oh, interesting.
Some argue it helps preserve, cultural heritage in those wine regions too.
So tariffs could lead to a boom for local wineries, even shape the character of the wines we drink. That's pretty impactful.
It can be, yeah.
What about the money made from these tariffs? The articles talked about government revenue.
Right.
Is that a big chunk of change?
Oh, absolutely. It can be substantial. What happens to it varies. Some governments use it for public services like healthcare, education.
Right.
Others might put it towards research and development or even offset budget deficits.
So those extra bucks we might spend on an imported bottle could actually end up funding those initiatives.
In a way, yeah.
That's really interesting. Adds a whole other layer to think about. It's not just about the price tag on the bottle, but where that money's going, how it gets used.
Exactly.
The articles also pointed out that tariffs can be a powerful tool in international trade negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like a bargaining chip.
Yeah, you could say that. It's leverage to push other countries to maybe lower their own trade barriers or to address what's seen as unfair practices.
Oh, I see.
There was that whole dispute between the U.S. and the EU over Airbus subsidies.
Right.
The U.S. slapped tariffs on European wines, among other goods, to use as leverage in those negotiations.
Wow. So it's almost like this delicate dance between countries trying to protect their own interests while navigating these complex trade relationships.
It's a complicated world out there.
Speaking of complex, what about the impact on us, the consumers? Seems like higher prices are the most obvious downside.
That's the most immediate hit, yeah. When tariffs are in place, imported wines, they just become less affordable. That ripples out. Affects consumer choices. So
we might be less likely to, splurge on that special bottle from a new region.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Or you might stick to, the more familiar options.
Right. Yeah.
Limits access to those hidden gems, from different regions, smaller producers, the kind of stuff that a lot of wine enthusiasts love discovering. For those folks who love variety, exploration, tariffs can feel, kind of limiting.
It almost sounds like it could stifle that excitement of finding new wines, exploring different styles, regions. I imagine that could impact businesses too, right? Like restaurants, wine shops that rely on those imports?
Absolutely. Places that pride themselves on a diverse wine list, they're the ones hit hardest.
Yeah.
They might have to raise prices, change what they offer, or eat the costs themselves. Hurts their bottom line. Tricky situation all around.
Sounds like tariffs create this whole web of consequences. It's not just about the price of a single bottle, it's the whole ecosystem. The wine industry itself, even what's available to us, the drinkers.
You got it.
Yeah.
To really grasp those nuances, you got to look beyond the surface. Think about the bigger economic, cultural implications.
Well said. So we've established that these tariffs, they're a double-edged sword. Potential benefits, drawbacks for producers, consumers, even on that international relations level. But let's dig into those downsides a bit more.
All right, let's do it. So, one thing that's really interesting about wine tariffs is how they can impact things that seem totally unrelated.
Oh, like what?
Well, think about tourism. Wine regions, they're a big draw, right?
Yeah, for sure.
People come from all over to experience the vineyards, the culture, try the local wines, obviously.
Right.
But if tariffs make those wines more expensive, suddenly those destinations might be less appealing,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Less tourism dollars. Impacts the local economies.
Exactly. A policy meant to protect one industry, like winemaking, could actually end up hurting another.
It's all connected.
It is. And those Wine Maps articles, they also talked about how tariffs can mess with global trade flows, too. Creates a lot of uncertainty, right?
Yeah, I bet. For businesses especially.
Oh, absolutely. When tariffs pop up, it throws a wrench in things. Supply chains get disrupted, trade relationships get strained, businesses relying on imported wines, they got to scramble to find new sources, adjust their prices. Costly, time-consuming.
Sounds like a headache.
It can be.
So with all this back and forth, who's keeping things in check? I remember the articles mentioned the World Trade Organization, the WTO. What's their role in all of this?
The WTO, they're kind of like the referee in the global trade game.
Okay.
They set the rules, the guidelines, try to make sure trade flows smoothly, predictably.
Yeah.
And freely, as much as possible.
Right. So they're the ones stepping in when things get heated, like with the US and the EU or China and Australia.
Exactly. They mediate, try to find a resolution, prevent things from turning into, a full-blown trade war, which can hurt everyone.
Yeah, no one wins in a trade war.
Exactly. But, these negotiations, they can be tough, complicated, drawn out.
I can imagine, with so many different interests at play.
Oh, for sure.
I remember those Wine Maps articles mentioned some specific examples of, recent wine tariff disputes. Can you refresh our memory on those?
Sure. One that's still going on is between the U.S. and the EU. Started back in 2019, the U.S. put tariffs on a bunch of European goods, wine included, part of a long disagreement about subsidies for Airbus, the aircraft manufacturer.
Oh, great.
Some of those tariffs have been lifted, but some are still in place.
So it's better, but still not fully resolved. These trade disagreements, they can really drag on, huh?
They can, and have long-lasting effects.
What about that China-Australia dispute? That one seemed pretty intense.
Yeah, that one was a big deal.
Yeah.
In 2020, China slapped huge tariffs on Australian wines. Basically stopped imports altogether. Really hit the Australian wine industry hard.
Wow. Part of that bigger trade and diplomatic fight they were having.
Yeah.
Did those tariffs ever get lifted?
They did earlier this year. But, the Australian wine industry, they've still got a long way to go to recover their position in China.
It's kind of scary how political stuff can spill over into trade like that with real consequences.
Absolutely.
So, as a consumer, I gotta ask, is there any way to tell if the price I'm paying for a bottle of wine is higher because of tariffs?
It's a good question, but it's not always easy to pinpoint. Your receipt won't have a line item that says tariff. It's more complicated than that.
So it's not as simple as, tariff equals higher price.
No, not really. Lots of things go into the final price of a bottle of wine. Production costs, transportation, exchange rates, markups from importers and retailers, even just basic supply and demand. Tariffs definitely make things more expensive for the folks bringing the wine into the country, but those costs don't always get passed directly to the consumer.
So it's not a direct cause and effect, more like a bunch of factors at play. Are there any, clues, things consumers can look out for?
You might see some trends, yeah. Like if there's a tariff on wines from a specific region, you might notice prices going up a bit overall for wines from that area.
So like a ripple effect, not a tidal wave. Are there any resources consumers can use to stay up to date on these tariff situations? Like see if they're affecting prices?
Oh, for sure. Wine publications, industry websites, even some retailers will have info on current tariffs and how they might be impacting things. We're checking those out.
Good to know. It's always good to be informed. So even though figuring out the impact of tariffs on wine prices might take some digging, it's worth it, right? Helps us understand what's going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have a question that's been bugging me.
Shoot.
We've talked about how tariffs can lead to higher prices for us, the consumers. But could there be cases where tariffs actually benefit us in the long run? Like maybe by helping to create a stronger domestic wine industry, one that eventually gives us more choices, maybe even lower prices down the road.
It's a really good question, and it gets to the heart of the debate about the long-term effects of tariffs. It's possible, under the right conditions, that tariffs could help build a more competitive domestic wine industry, which ultimately would be good for consumers.
What would those conditions be? What would need to happen?
Well, first off, the tariffs would need to be temporary. and targeted, give domestic producers a chance to invest, innovate, improve their quality, become more efficient.
Okay.
What you don't want is for them to become too reliant on those tariffs for protection, because then they lose the incentive to compete on a global level.
So it's all about balance, supporting domestic producers, but also making sure there's healthy competition.
Exactly. Done right, tariffs could be that push for growth and innovation, but it's a tricky equation. Lots of variables.
Sounds like there's no easy answer when it comes to tariffs. It really depends on the situation, the goals, and how it's all implemented.
Absolutely. That's what makes it so interesting, right? You have to think critically, consider all sides, recognize how economics, politics, even culture all play a part.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. Ripple effects, pricing complexities, the WTO, those trade disputes.
It's been a journey.
And it's not over yet. All right, we're back for the final pour in our deep dive on wine tariffs. Feels like we've uncorked a whole cellar of info here.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure. How these tariffs work, the pluses, the minuses, what it means for producers, consumers, even the whole global scene.
Totally. We talked about their impact on local wineries, consumer choices, how they play into those international negotiations, even the potential for things to go sideways, like with trade wars.
And we dug into how those tariffs might be sneaking into the price of that bottle you pick up at the store.
Right. Makes you think, how something as simple as enjoying a glass of wine is tied to all these global forces. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your, key takeaways. What are the big things our listeners should remember about these wine tariffs?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that wine tariffs, they're not inherently good or bad, It's a tool, basically, that governments use to try and achieve certain things. Economic goals, political goals.
So it's not about picking a side. It's more about, understanding the nuances, how they work, what the impacts could be.
Exactly. You got to look at the context, what the policy is trying to do, and what the potential consequences are for everyone involved.
Makes sense. Anything else?
I'd say another big takeaway is that these tariffs, they have ripple effects. It's not just about the immediate target. It goes beyond that. Impacts different sectors, like tourism, retail, even global trade and diplomacy.
Like a chain reaction, almost. One policy decision can set off a whole cascade of consequences. Some you expect, some you don't.
Exactly. And those unintended consequences, those can be a big deal. Like we saw with those retaliatory tariffs, escalating trade tensions, sometimes even harming the very industries they were supposed to be helping.
So it's a tightrope walk for those making the policies, balancing the potential benefits with the risks of, things backfiring. What about for us, the everyday wine drinkers? What can we do to navigate all of this?
Stay informed. That's the big one. Keep up with what's happening in the industry, news about trade disputes. There are resources out there that can help you understand how tariffs might be affecting prices, availability. Do some digging.
The more we know, the better choices we can make, right? And we can be part of the conversation about these issues.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Do your own research. Form your own opinions based on what you find.
Makes you realize we as consumers have some power here to shape the industry by making informed choices and speaking up about policies that matter to us.
That's right. And at the end of the day, wine is meant to be enjoyed. So while it's important to understand all this stuff about trade and tariffs, don't let it overshadow the simple pleasure of, trying new wines, sharing a bottle with friends.
Well said. I think that's the perfect way to wrap things up. We've really gone deep on wine tariffs, their impact on the world of wine, and hopefully given our listeners the knowledge to navigate this whole thing a little better.
It's been great chatting with you about all this. Hope our listeners found it informative, maybe even a little bit fun.
And to our listeners, cheers to you. May your glass always be full, and may your curiosity never run dry. Until next time.